Alright guys, this is LSAT PrepTest 68, Section 4, questions 17 through 23. And I'm going to preface this by saying that if you thought that last game was difficult, then this one's going to be even more so. Because that last one was just a little bit weird. The third game in the section was just a little weird. Took a little getting used to. This one is actually legitimately difficult, right? In the sense that there's first of all, if you notice, there are 7 questions here. And second of all, what you will notice, or if you've already taken this exam like you should have, what you do know already is that all 7 of those questions, or 6 of those 7, with the exception of the acceptability question, are extremely difficult. So let's go ahead and just get started and look at this. So an editor will add 7 articles one at a time. So 3 of the articles, G, H, and J, cover finance. So we have a finance category, G, H, and J. Okay. 3 other articles, Q, R, and S, cover nutrition. So we have nutrition, Q, R, and S. Okay. And the remaining article, Y, covers wildlife. Wildlife is covered by Y. Okay. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 slots, numbered. Okay. So the order in which the articles are edited is subject to the following conditions. Okay, so before we go to the rules, we know a couple of things. First of all, we know this is a sequencing game, right? Because they give us 7 things. They want to know what order that they're going to be edited in. Second of all, we know that the fact that they're giving us these categories tells us that probably these categories are going to come into it in some way, shape, or form. Your rules are probably going to use those categories so that not only do you have to keep track of the elements themselves, but they can use the categories as proxies for those elements. Like, so for example, rather than saying, G, H, or J has to come in the first slot, they'll just say a finance article is in the first slot. And so that's just another way for them to potentially confuse you, potentially make you forget what it is you're working with. Okay. So speaking of the rules, let's get to it. So consecutive articles cannot cover the same topic as each other. Okay, so there's the big one, right? This immediately tells me that these categories are going to be extremely important. The way I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna say FF can't be together. I'm gonna say NN can't be together. But take a second to think about the implications of this rule, right? Because we have 6 elements, 3 of which are in the F's, 3 of which are in the N's, right? And we only have 7 slots. And so, as an aside, let's pretend for a moment that we only had 6 slots, and we're just going to get rid of this Y element entirely, right? And this happens actually in a lot of other logic games. What you see is that if you have these 6 elements grouped into these 2 categories, and these guys can't be next to each other, then what you're going to have is either you're going to have F spread out this way, which means N is going to be this way, or you're going to have N spread out in 1, 3, and 5, meaning that F's got to be in 2, 4, and 6. And the reason for that, I hope, is readily apparent, because the thing that you need to avoid at all costs is putting 2 of these guys together, right? So the moment that you have, for example, let's take another example. And I know these are ugly dashes. But let's say, for example, that we want to put G into slot 2. Well, immediately that means that there's going to be no G or no H and no J here. There's going to be no H or no J there, right? Which means that the earliest that you can put something, the remaining H or J is going to be here. And the problem is that if you don't do that, if you push it off until here, then what you're doing is you're leaving these 2 slots to be filled by the other by the other category, right? And that's not okay. The only way, so intuitively speaking, the only way you can fit 6 elements in 2 groups into, these 6 slots is if you alternate them, right? Okay, so that much is fairly self-explanatory, but what does that have to do with the question we have at hand? Well, the only difference here is that now we have this Y element, right? And this Y element gives us potentially a lot more options. So not only can we can slot it in anywhere between where we would have otherwise put, if, for example, we put FN, 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 we can put this Y element anywhere, and it'll be fine. And the thing is that it splits up, like what it makes possible is it makes possible for us, before if you wanted to put F and F together, it wouldn't work. But now that you can put a Y between them, now you can have them go in sort of, separate, not separate, but you can make them have, this particular pattern, or I guess it wouldn't be that. I guess it would be this. It would be this, right? Then you could have them sort of like change the order, or whatever the case may be. And so none of this obviously is set in stone. But the point is that just immediately reading this first rule and looking at our setup, I see that this is hugely restrictive in terms of what we can do with our elements, right? And where this Y goes is unbelievably important. Because that's going to determine how the rest of this works. So we'll talk about that more in a second once we get through the rest of the rules. Okay, so let's just do that. Second, S can be earlier than Q only if Q is third. So only if is what? Only if gives me the necessary condition. So only if Q is third, so Q is in 3, right? So only if Q is in third can what happen? Can S be before Q? Okay, and so the first thing I want to do here is I want to take the contrapositive. If Q is not in 3, then S is not before Q. In other words, Q is before S, right? And so here's the thing that's important. You have to recognize that this statement right here is a conditional. It is an if statement. If S is before Q, Q is third, right? And so a common mistake that people make is that they assume that when Q is third, S has to be over here somewhere, right? But does that really have to be the case? No, it doesn't, because, you know, what we're doing here, Q is third, we're satisfying the necessary condition. And what does satisfying a necessary condition get us? It gets us nothing, right? Then the whole thing just drops out, and it's like, well, we don't have a rule anymore. We've satisfied a necessary, but that doesn't lead to any kind of conclusion, right? So it's important to understand what that means. Whereas this rule, the contrapositive, I think is much more straightforward, because it's much easier to tell whether or not Q is going to be in 3. But in any case, this second rule also has room to trip up. And so at all times you need to make sure that you remember that this is a conditional statement. Not, you know, this is not equivalent to Q3 implies S before Q, right? No. Let's get rid of that, because I don't even want that clouding our judgment. Okay, next. S is earlier than Y. A nice, simple sequencing rule for us, right? And rule number 4. Rule number 4 says J must be earlier than G, so J is before G, and G must be earlier than R. So again, another nice, simple sequencing rule for us. Okay. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to color code these in order to make it easier for us to see. Alright, so let's use blue for the finance, J, G, and H. Let's use green for nutrition, because nutrition is green, Q, R, and S. And let's use red for the wildlife, the Y, because it's the wild card, it's the dangerous one. So I'm actually just going to fix up my rules here a little bit to reflect the new color coding, so give me 1 second. Okay, so see what I've did is just everything that's an F I made into blue, so these F's over here, the J and the G over here. Everything that pertains with the N's, the nutrition stuff, I've put in green, so S and Q, and S and R over here. And then Y just remains Y. And for the record, the reason that there's no WW/ over here is just because there's only one wildlife article, so you're gonna have a really tough time putting that next to another wildlife article that doesn't exist, right? Okay. And so this, like, I don't even know where to start as far as this is concerned, right? So I mean, like, one thing that you can link up immediately is that if Q is not 3, you link up rule 2 and 3 in terms of now Q is before S is before Y. But the thing is that, you know, like S before Q, I mean, I guess technically you could also do this, but this doesn't tell me very much. If S is before Y and it's before Q, well, S is always before Y. Right? This makes it look like it's conditional, whereas in reality this is not conditional. This is a set in stone rule, so let's not do that. But nevertheless, you know, like I see that there's this little connection over here, and then there's nothing else, right? Like J and G are not mentioned anywhere else over here. R isn't mentioned anywhere in these other two rules, right? These two are just generic rules, which means that you're not going to be able to link anything specific up to them. And so this game is wide open at this point. And so what I fall back on is I know that the LSAT, this is a logical thing, which means that, you know, this other, you know, the thing that we just talked about for the last 5 minutes or so, where the F's and the N's are going to be severely restricted. There's only so many ways that you can put them together, and that Y is going to be really important. That's the only thing that we can really figure out, you know, insofar as pre-logic game inferences go. And I mean, I don't see anything. There's nothing here really that's set in stone otherwise. And so it's really not going to be possible for you to come to, you know, solid conclusions that break the game wide open here. So it's best just to not worry about that too much. So let's just actually, you know, draw our line. This is our master diagram, and we're just going to go straight to the questions, right? Okay, so 17 is your acceptability question, and it's the only one that is, I think reasonably simple in this game. So it says, which of the following is an acceptable order for editing the articles from 1st through 7th? This is just your simple process of elimination mechanism once again. So all right, those are the answer choices. Let's just go through them with some red ink. I think the easiest ones to start with are these down here: S before Y, J before G before R. Let's just do this one: S before Y, good. S before Y, S before Y. No. And S before Y. Okay, J before G. Let's check that element first, or let's just do both. J before G before R, 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 J before J and G. So no. Okay. Next up, we're left with these two sort of less, less concrete rules. But this one's pretty concrete, right? If Q is not 3, then Q before S before Y. And here we see that Q is not 3 in any of our remaining answer choices, so therefore we're looking for Q before S before Y. You remember that we combine these rules together, right? So Q before S, no. Q before S before Y, Q before S before Y. Good. Okay, which means that our last option is just this guy. You can't have two of the same ones together. So GH and J are together, so let's just check these. GH and J, G and H are together there. And so therefore answer choice C has to be your answer here. Like I said, this is your only reprieve, so you better get ready now for some mind bending. Okay. So next, 18. If Y is 4th, which of the following must be true? Okay. So this is going to be your first real question in this game, and there should be 7 dashes. And as far as that's concerned, it's relatively easy, right? Okay. So they tell us that Y has got to be in this 4th slot. Okay. And so what does that mean? What are we left with? We're left with the blue. We've used the red elements. We're left with the blue elements. We're left with the green elements, right? And so it's worth thinking about how these guys could possibly be put into our diagram if Y is smack dab right in the center, right? For all intents and purposes, this, there's nothing else tricky about this game other than you just have to place these things, right? Well, there's a couple of different ways you could do that. You could do an F here, an F here, and what does that mean? It means you have to have an F here, or you can do the ends, right? Which means that the F's and the ends trade off like this. And I hope it's clear the reason why that's the case. Because, for example, let's try to put, let's start with an F here, right? Obviously, you're not going to put an F right here because that violates your first rule, which means that this is the this is the closest you can put it. So let's say you're not going to do this, you're not going to do this, right? And then this Y happens. And then what are you going to do, right? You have these two spaces, and what do they have in common? Well, they're not blue spaces. You've already used your red space, so these are going to have to be green spaces, and that means you're going to violate this rule, right? And so what ends up happening is that these are the only two ways that it's going to work. You're going to have, it's either going to be 1, 3, and what is this? 1, 4, 5, 6. 1, 3, and 6 being Fs, or 1, 3, and 6 being Ns, right? There's no other way that you can place these guys without violating rule number 1. And so as far as this game goes, this one is relatively easy, only because none of these other rules really come into play. If you really want to, you could say, S is before Y over here. S is one of these green spaces. J before G before R, we just don't really know, where that goes. Okay, but anyway, what are they asking us? They're asking us, which of the following must be true? Okay, so this is something that must be true, which means that we should be able to figure it out sort of just by looking at what we have. Like this new piece of information must have told us something, right? So this is the first inference that we make. The problem is that you look at your answer choices, all of them, and I'll reproduce them down below. Right, all these answer choices are very specific about the thing that they're not saying, oh, there is a nutrition thing in the second slot, or whatever the case may be. They talk about specific elements, and they're asking for a specific slot that it must be in, which means that there has to be something that we can get out of the rest of our rules, right? So this rule is taken care of, this first rule, by our inference like so. So what do we have here? Well, they give us this Y, right? So what do we know about Y? Well, we know that S has to come before it. So one of two possibilities: either S is before Y here, or S is before Y in one of these two spots, right? And if you think about it, there's no other way that could possibly be. because, S has to be before Y. S is a nutrition element, which means it's either going to be solely in 2 or it's going to be in 1 and 3, right? So let's think about what we have here for a second. Right? We have S before Y, and so let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just try it by placing the S in our second slot. Right? Let's just see what happens here. So S is before Y, we satisfied our rule, right? Well, here's the thing: S and Q are the same nutrition element, which means that now we're definitely going to satisfy S's before Q, right? Because no matter what, if we put S in the second slot, Q is going to come after Y, right? That must mean that Q is 3. Except, wait a second, right? We have green slot with green slot, and we can't do that, right? And so we know, actually, that this is not going to work, which leaves us just this order of elements, right? Okay, and so now, we're still in kind of a pickle, right? We need to put S before Q, or we need to put S before Y, rather, and so it's either going to be here or here, right? So there's not going to be an S here, and so if you think about it for a second, now if you put S here, then Q is going to come either here or there, right? Well, if you put S here, then Q has to come here, because Q's got to be in 3, right? If you put S here, then what do you know? Then you know that Q has to come before S. So in other words, Q has to come over here, right? So you see that these two elements actually just switch off, right? You can put either one in either place, and you can satisfy this rule, because if S is before Q, this is satisfied. If S is in 3, that means Q has to be before it per our conditional, right? So this actually gives us a lot of information. Q, S, right? Q and S are done. So that means R has to go over here. And then as far as the F's are concerned, right, what do we have? We have J before G, right? And G is before R. So J has to be before G, and both of them have to be before R, which means H fills our final slot. And so these two guys switch off, S and Q, Q and S, but the rest of these are determined for us. And so we look at our answer choices. J is 2. Yeah, it's right there. And if you just convince yourself really quickly of the others, you'll see that none of them are the case, right? Okay, so let's actually. I'm actually going to move this. I'm going to move this up here. I'm going to try to conserve a little bit of space, and you'll see why in a second. Okay, let's make this a little smaller, actually. Hopefully you can still see that. Okay, good. Let's move to 19. So 19 is even tougher. 19 says if G is 4th, which of the following could be true. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now G is 4th, and G is a blue element, so I'll call it a blue element. Right? Okay, wow. So now, what do I even do with that? Right? So I mean, you just go to your rules. This doesn't help me very much. This has nothing to do with G. This has nothing to do with G, which means that this has to be the one that helps me, right? J before G before R. So I know that J has to come before G, which in turn comes before R, which means that J is over here somewhere. And then R is over here somewhere. And so let's leave. Actually, I could probably make this a little neater. We can just leave them in their relative places for now, right? J before G before R. Okay, and so that means we don't need this anymore. And so what does that give us, right? Because now what we've done is we've sort of cut our options down significantly, because we know that this can't be the first the first finance element. Right. Well, not that it could have been anyway, right? Because if this is the first finance element, the second one goes either here or here, and the third one, who knows? But we also know it can't be the third finance element, right? Because look what we have. If we have J in one of these 3 slots, and we want G to be the third finance element, then how are we going to fit the H in here, right? The H is either going to be next to the J, or it's going to be next to the G, which means that we're going to violate our first rule, and we can't do that, right? So what does that tell us? That tells us that the H has to be over here, right? And even more so, H can't be, it can't be next to G, can't be next to the J wherever it goes, which means that H has to be in one of these 2 slots, right? Okay, all right. And so what does that leave us? That leaves us, we're done with our finance elements, at least sort of, right? We're left with the Q and the S, and we're left with the Y. Okay, and so now this is going to be clearly, I think, the more restrictive of the two, right? Because we have to separate Q and S, and more, even more so, we have to separate them from the R that's over here, right? Which means that there's a very limited set of ways that you can do this, and still, for the record, stay with this rule, because if Q is not third, then we have this Q before S before Y thing that triggers, and that becomes just a huge other headache. So we have to make sure that we take all of these things into consideration. And so, obviously, right, we have this QR we need to separate from this R, and we also have this rule to fulfill. I think this is clearly the place that we need to go. So let's think about this for a second, right? Let's just start with this guy. If S is before Q, then Q is in 3. So if S is before Q, then Q is going to be in 3. Right? Well, if Q is in 3, and this is true, right? If this is true, then Q is in 3. What does that do to Y? It pushes the Y over to this side of G, right? Because we have to put a J in here somewhere, and so S, J, and Q take up all the spaces to the left of G, which means that the Y has to hang out with R and H, right? Okay, so let's say that that's not true. Let's say that Q is not 3. Okay, that means that Q is before S, which is before Y. Well, again, right, we have sort of these 3 open spaces. We have 1 space over to the right, 2 spaces over to the left. If Q is before S is before Y, then Q and S have to be over here, and Y has to be over here, right? Because we only have 1 slot open over here, which means the last element of our little ordering has to go over here, right? So you see that in either case, it turns out that Y has to hang out over here with R and H, which leaves us Q and S to hang out over here. So I'm just gonna, do this. And here, it should be noted that we don't really know anything about the Y, the R, and the H, and how they go. There's a lot of different ways that this could work. You just need to keep this G and this H away from each other, right? But here, there's not nearly as many places they can go. And in fact, that we can put it straight in, right? This J has to be here, and sort of cribbing from what we did in question 18 right here, we know that these Q and S can switch off, right? Because if S is before Q, then Q is going to be in 3, check. If Q is not in 3, then Q is going to be before S, also check, right? And so it turns out that this is going to be what happens, right? It's actually going to look very similar to what we have up here, except that now that this Y and this G kind of trade off, and we don't really have as much certainty about the right side of that. So let's go ahead and look at the answers. All right, so it turns out that, well, let's see. Right? It looks like A is a pretty good candidate. H can be in 5. Oh, wait. No, it doesn't, because 5 is this slot. Haha, I can count. H can only be in 6 or 7, so that's going to be out. J is in 1. No, it has to be in 2. Q is in 2. No, it has to be in 1 or 3. S can be 5. No, S is going to be on the left side of G, either 1 or 3, which means that Y being 6 is the only one that is possible, right? And we know this because, once again, I think that this is a little misleading. It may give the impression that Y is definitely in 5, but we don't actually know anything about the order of these 3 elements other than that H has to avoid G, right? Okay, so I'm going to, let's shrink these in the interest of more space and move on. And the reason that I'm saving these will be evident in a second. Okay, so question 20. Let's do question 20 over here. Question 20 asks us, which of the following could be true? Okay, and so they don't give us any other information, which means that we're going to have to evaluate the answer choices one by one. So, okay, so this question seems very abstract, but it's not actually as bad as it looks. So question 20 rather, just which of the following could be true. And so they give you the set of things that you just have to evaluate. So the trick here is to do it quickly and to look back at your rules and just kind of, use the information that you have here and just the thing that you've learned about the game thus far in order to make just a quick elimination of all of these things, right? So the first thing you can do is you can look through, your previous work, and if you find that one of these things could be true, you can just pick it and move on, right? Unfortunately, I'm sure this is on purpose, none of these answer choices are reflected in either question 18 or question 19 or this guy in question 17, and so it means that we actually have to do some work here, right? Okay, but it turns out that these aren't actually difficult answer choices to evaluate. So let's take a look at answer choice A. If G is 2, J has to precede it, so J has to be 1. So this means that you're going to have JG in 1 and 2, and then 5 extra slots. And that's a problem because they're both blue elements. So A is out. H in 2, on the other hand, right, you see, I don't know a lot about H. So my immediate inclination is that, if there's something wrong about this that makes it not possible, it's going to take me a little longer to figure out. But at least on the surface of it, it doesn't appear that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. So I'm just going to leave it as it is. There are two directions you can take here, actually. The first one is you can actually draw out a hypothetical, put H in 2, and see what happens. Let's do H, J, DJ, Q, R, S, and Y. And this works, right? And so you can pick it right there. If you don't want to do this and this is perfectly fine, by the way. There's nothing wrong with doing this. But I like to know, especially when reviewing logic games, why the other ones are wrong and what they expect to see out of you, in order to eliminate quickly. Because if this was an answer choice E, for example, then you would have had to slog through a bunch of others, and then it helps to know what to look for in order to eliminate quickly, right? Okay, so I'm going to get rid of these hypotheticals. Like B is going to be the answer because we just drew out a hypothetical that worked. So I'm actually going to reproduce it. Right, let's say H here, G and J, and then let's say Q. Or actually, I guess that's not quite right. It has to be J before G before R, right? Satisfying this rule. S has to be for Y. S has to be for Y, and let's just put Q here. And that works because if S is before Q, then Q is 3. So this is something that works, right? So we've created a hypothetical, and it's fine. So this has to be our answer. But let's look at the rest of them anyway, right? Okay, so answer choice C, putting S in 2. Well, here's the problem with putting S in 2, right? Because one of two things is going to happen here. Either, and it goes back to this rule, right? Because S comes before Y. Okay, that's not such a big deal. We can put S. We just know that Y is not 1 in that case. But this relationship it has with Q is interesting, right? And so here's the thing. If S is before Q, Q is 3, right? So if S is before Q, which in this case, it either is or it isn't. So let's say it is. Let's say that it satisfies this sufficient condition. Then Q is going to be in 3, which means you have blank S, Q, blank, blank, blank. These are the same element, the nutrition, and so that's not allowed, right? What if that's not the case? What if Q is not in 3? If Q is not in 3, that means Q has to come before S. So if S is 2 and Q is not in 3, it's going to be in 1, which once again violates the exact same rule, right? So no matter what happens, no matter whether or not S is before Q or S is after Q, the point is that they're always going to be smashed together by answer choice C in a way that is not allowed for by the rules. And so therefore that is incorrect. It's not ever going to be true. And if you don't believe me, pause this video, take a second, and try to put out some kind of hypothetical that matches, and you'll find that you can't. The rest of these are a little more straightforward. R being 3 means that J is 1 and G is 2, and these are together. Can't have that. Y in 3 means that we're here, right? It means that Q is not 3, which means that Q is for S before Y, and that puts Q and S together. And so that's also not right. And so therefore answer choice B, we've proven to ourselves, is the correct answer here. And again, because it just cannot be emphasized enough, even though under test conditions, if you looked at answer choice B and you were able to see that it was a good, that it was good, and you were able to create a hypothetical, that's really great. More power to you. You move on to the next question, and that's a fine thing to do. But especially when you're practicing, make sure that you look at what the LSAC wants you to think of it. So that, for example, if these answer choices went backwards and this was answer choice D, that you wouldn't have to waste a ton of time going through these 3 answer choices in order to get to the right answer. You don't have to try all of them. And in fact, it is you're probably making a mistake if you think that you do. Okay, so let's move on to question 21. What does that say? It says, if J is third, which one could be true? Okay, so J is going to be third. Let's actually write that in its blue so that we keep the color code. And so what do we know, right? Immediately, this piece of information tells me that there must be something over here that I should be able to know. So first, J is explicitly right here, right? J before G, before R. right? Which means that all of these elements are going to be on this side of the table. Okay, and what else? Well, j being 3 means that q is not 3, right? And so this is the part that I think that is really going to help us break this wide open. Q before s before y now triggers, right? Q is not 3, so q before s before y, so not q before s before y. So let's actually bring this down here. Let's get rid of this because it's redundant now. And so look what we have, right? This j is this j, right? And then it has to be before g, and it has to be before r, which means that these guys are going to be over here somewhere, right? Simultaneously, we have q before s before y, and then h is the last element that we have, and h kind of, subject to this rule, is essentially going to do whatever it wants, right? Okay, but it turns out that there isn't really that much it can do, right? And so here's the thing. Remember way back at the beginning when we said, and we've sort of seen it throughout this process as well, that this process of spreading out the different blue elements and different green elements can only take place in a couple of ways. I guess I should also color code these guys because this is I think a good example. G, H, and J. This is S, Q, and R. And this is y. And you see that in all of our previous work and over here as well, you see that things are spread out. And we went over the theoretical reason that has to be the case. So the point is that there's not so many ways that you can spread out 2 groups of 3 within 7 slots, right? Which means that, well, what does that mean? It means that G's got to be over here, and then R's got to be after it, which means that J before G before R, and then H could theoretically be over here as well, right? Either that or H is going to be over here, J is going to be over here, and G is going to be over here. And so because we know the starting position of this blue element, that's the reason that I'm looking at these 3 blue elements, right? But let's think about that for a second, right? Because J before G before H, we know that there has to be at least one spot between all of these guys, right? Which means that, well, this isn't going to be anything blue. This isn't going to be anything blue. Actually, I'm gonna cross these out in blue, right? This isn't going to be anything blue. And this isn't going to be anything blue, which means that the earliest we can place G is going to be over here, right? G makes this not blue, which means H is going to be over here, right? Okay, and so here's the issue with that. So this is fine, right? J before G, R is going to be over here, and that's fine. In fact, we can pencil that in right now. Here's the question. What do you do with Q and S? Right? Because you got 3 slots left, 3 elements left. Q and S are going to have to be right on top of each other over here if we shove both of these blue elements over to the right side. Right? And that's not okay. This is not okay. And so let's actually get rid of this whole thing. Let's redraw. You see, and so you see what we've done now. J before G. I probably shouldn't have erased all of these rules. Q before S before Y, right? So what we've done here is that we've made this floater H. We've tested it. We've sort of thought about what happens when you put G and H here and here, and we found out that it doesn't work, right? You can't, if you put H back here toward the end, you're going to squeeze Q and S together over here. Well, what does that mean? It means that Q's got to be on, if it's not on the right side of J, it's got to be on the left side of J. Well, it can't be here because of our first rule, which means that H, our quote-unquote floater, has to be in slot 1. Must be. And so this takes a huge weight off of your shoulders. Because what do you know? You know that J is followed by these 2 guys, right? So what is the only element that can be in this slot? Well, it's Q, because S isn't going to be here because it squeezes Q out. Certainly Y is not going to be here because it squeezes 2 elements out. So now you can place your Q element right here as well. And you can get rid of it from over here. And so now you have this S and Y over here on this side. You have this G and R again over here on this side. And at that point, you don't really know what's happening, right? The only thing that you know is that you have to keep this R and this S away from each other. But there's ways to do that. Or I guess you also need to keep this J and this G away from each other. But there's a couple different ways that you can put the Y and arrange the elements such that that's the case. But whatever the case may be, the point is I don't even think we need to do that. We just need to see if we can answer the question. And since there's no more certainty involved here, they're just asking us what could be true in this case, which means 4 of them must, in theory, be false. So looking at the answer choices, what do we have? Okay, so we have G is 4. No, because if you put G here, you have 2 blues together. That's not going to be right. H is 6. No, H has to be in 1. Q is 1. No, Q has to be in 2. S is 2. No, it's got to be on the right side of J. So answer choice E is going to be your answer. And if you want to convince yourself of answer choice E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Y is here, which means you can put the S right here. This rule is satisfied. Q is not 3, but Q is before S. And then you put G, and then you put R. And so you've proven to yourself that this works, right? This is the thing that makes answer choice E work. And so let's shrink this. Oops, did not mean to do that. Shrink this a little, put this up here. Okay, and so question 22 is the one that ends up being the one where we're going to need all of this other stuff, and the reason that we've saved all this prior work. Okay, and so question 22 asks us in the order with which the articles are edited, S could be any of the following except. So could be except. So 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So could be except, meaning that the one that we're looking for is the one that it cannot be in. And so S, as I'm sure you've noticed from our previous work, is a huge player, right? S, S, S. Like, we've always been able to know something about S. And so when you look at this question, right, we know it can be in 1. We know it can be in 3 because of these 2 guys. We know it can be in 4 because of the one that we just did. And then this guy, it's in 1 as well. So, okay. So now from trying to test 5 answer choices, you're now just down to testing these 2, right? Either 5 or 6. And so the way I want to look at this is, okay, now what else do I know about the term S, right? S is in these rules. So this is conditional. S before Q, I don't know if S is before Q, so I can't say anything about that. But I do know that S is before Y. And so when I'm given the choice between whether to test S in 5 or S in 6, I'm going to try to push it as far as possible to have the maximum amount of inferences possible, right? And so remember, way back in the beginning when we talked about how you could put Y anywhere, right? The simplest case is if you just leave it out of the way, right? If you leave Y out of the way, then these other 6 have to switch. And that's exactly what happens when you put S into 6. Because S is before Y, so if S is 6, Y is 7, right? For all intents and purposes, you don't care about this anymore, right? Because this is going to be nutrition, nutrition, nutrition. This is going to be finance, finance, finance. S is not going to be before Q, so this rule doesn't matter. This rule is satisfied, so the only thing you need to do is put J and G before R, right? J and G come before R. And then the rest of this fills in. This is Q. This is H. And this works. Which means that you know that 6 works, which, hold on a second. Does that mean that that's your answer? The answer is no. Because all of these work, answer choice D does not. And so in order to see that, I actually probably should have put this a little further down, so let's actually do that. This is 6. This arrowhead is now completely redundant. Right. This is 6 down here. 5 up here. Let's take a look at what that would look like. If S is 5, right, and S is the green element, then what do we know? We know that Y has got to be after it. Okay, Y has got to be over here somewhere, which means that here, what do we have? We have that if S is before Q, Q is in 3. Well, if S is before Q, there's no way that we're going to satisfy this. Like, if S is before Q, we're just going to violate this rule, right? Similarly, if Q is not 3, then Q for Y before S is not going to happen. Right, and then when you look at this, the only other rule that we really have here, J before G, before R. And, I just leave you to this exercise. How do you fit these 3 elements into this framework without having repeats? And remember that H is present as well. And the answer is that you can't. Because if you put J in 1, and G in 3, for example, then R is going to rub up against S somewhere, or H is going to have to be somewhere right next to J and G. And so, like, you can take my word for it that that's not the case, or if you don't want to, then this can be an exercise for you to convince yourself that you can't actually put S in 5, right? But this is a question where our previous work comes in huge handy in terms of just, the amount of work that we have to do. And so, just leave it at that. At least on the test, there's no real reason why you have to try out the 5 if you know 6 works, right? Okay. Home stretch. The order in which the articles are edited fully determined if which one of the following is true. Okay. So this question is like question 20, where they just throw out a question for you, no additional information, nothing, and then it looks like you have to slog through each of the answer choices, right? H is 6, R is 4, R is 7, Y is 5. Okay, and so this is what I mean when I say, this is a question that tests your intuition about how this game works. And so what I notice here is that you have this H and this H, right? This piece of information is supposed to tell us exactly what is going on, right? When I look at my list of rules here, I don't have a rule for H. It's like, okay, so I know that H is 4, I know that H is 6. What does that tell me, right? So while I'm not going to immediately eliminate them, what I am going to do is discount them a little bit, or heavily, probably actually, in terms of how like my priority of trying these guys out, right? Whereas answer choice C and answer choice D, right? These are elements I'm more drawn to because I have a rule here, J before G before R, that I can use to kind of see what works or see what's happening, right? And then this Y element I also have here, but it's less restrictive. So the order that I would try these in is I would look at these R ones first, right? These would be my first priority. This guy would be my second priority. And only if all of these wind up not fully, giving me what I want, would I try for A and B. And the reason for that is just that, again, in terms of rule restrictiveness, R is by far the most restrictive, and H is the least restrictive of this bunch. So let's try here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So they're telling us in answer choice C that R is 4, right? Whereas they're telling us in answer choice D that R is 7. It's worth looking at the differences. Because here, what do we have? R is the last of these elements, right? J before G before R. Which means that if I put R last, this is going to be, well, J before G. Of course it's going to be before R. This doesn't help me whatsoever, right? Okay. And it doesn't, in particular, it doesn't tell me where anything has to go. Whereas this guy, on the other hand, J before G before R, I know, right? Because J and G have to be, 2 of these 3 slots before R, which means that one of 2 things has to be the case. It's either going to be that J and G are like this, or it's going to be either JG or JG, right? And we know that this isn't going to work, because in either of these cases, they're going to be way too close to each other, right? Okay, and so we know that J before G before R is now satisfied, and answer choice C, remember that it's answer choice C that we're trying right now, forces this to be the case. This is spectacular for us, because now we have rules that we can draw further inferences off of, right? If G is going to be in 3, Q is not going to be in 3, which means that Q has to be before S, which has to be before Y. Well, we're not going to put Q, S, and Y over here, because that's going to be 3 green elements in a row. That's a ton, right? So what do we know? We know that Q's got to be over here. We know that S can't be next to R, so it's got to be here, right? Which tells us what? Which tells us Y is here, because S is before Y, which leaves us with H, this element right here. And so that's why answer choice C is the answer here. And at this point, this is a question more of your intuition, your understanding of this game and its elements and how the things fit together. And because if you go through these 5 answer choices, brute forcing it, I promise you, you will spend at least 5 times as much time as I just did, and I have to explain it to people, so it's even slower for me, right? It's impossible to just, does this work, doesn't it work? It just takes way too much time. In general, that's the theme of this game. is that if you try to brute force your way through this entire game, even if you know exactly what you're doing at all times, it'll probably take you on the order of 15 to 16 minutes. And that's just way too much for a logic game. Even if you blow through the first 3 of this section, it doesn't matter. That is way too much time to be taking for any single logic game. Which means that the goal of working through this logic game in such a long form manner is to get you to understand that your intuition and your inferences don't necessarily have to be set in stone for you to have a greater understanding of what's going on. And that's what we're really going for here. Because your greater understanding of what's going on leads you to all these answer choices in much less time than it would take you to just brute force your way through all of them. And that's what the LSAT's looking for. That's what the LSAT is trying to see whether you have the capability to follow your instinct and know which things to test and how things fit together, even if nothing is certain, even if nothing is set in stone, that there's still general guidelines that you can use to make these things all work together. And so this, I think, by far the toughest game of Test 68, but that's what it is. And if you have difficulty with this game, I recommend you go through all the explanations again, listen to all of them again one by one, and try to understand what the inferences are and what the connections are that we can make, even though nothing is set in stone.